Okay, so we will continue the presentation of each second team. So today we will have about 50 or 55 minutes presentation on pattern recognition, pattern classification by the team number 1 and Naguib and names. Okay, so come and start, please.
Thank you, Professor. Hello, everyone. Today, me and my colleague Naim will talk about pattern classification. Okay, so today we will talk about the textbook of pattern classification. In particular, we will present the first 7 chapters. We will talk about some topics from the 10th chapter as well. So I will first start by introducing what is the meaning of pattern classification, talk about Bayesian decision theory and maximum likelihood estimate and Bayesian estimate. Then my colleague Naim will come and talk about non-parametric techniques, linear discriminant functions, and then we will talk about neural networks and deep networks after that. So this textbook is really important. The first edition was published back in 1973. The second edition was 2001. It was a key and a very important textbook for many of the pattern classification courses all over the world. Here in our campus, there are 2 courses that use this textbook as a reference, in particular Advanced Computer Vision by Professor Ijun Hu and Math for Big Data, this course by Professor Lee. So this is a quick summary of the textbook. We need to learn how to do classification. So if we have a pattern, what kind of pattern it is? Is it continuous or discrete? If it's continuous, do we have any prior model or not? Do we have any prior probability or not? And based on this kind of tree, we can decide which tool is better to handle this problem than the others. These terminologies are basically, we will go through them in the presentation, so you don't have to worry about the meaning of them right now. This is a summary of the terminology. You can go through it if you have. Yes. So these are the terminologies. You can go through these terminologies if you need to know some understanding of these parts.
You have enough time. So
I will go this. So first, what is classification? Okay, let's give an example. Let's say that we have a factory and we would like to classify between 2 different types of fishes, the salmon fish and the sea bass fish. So we take a picture, but before we start, the algorithm needs to know where in this picture is a potential fish in which we need to classify. So this is typically a problem called segmentation, in which we need to know where in this image is the part that we need to measure and check. Once we have this ROI, or region of interests, we can start to measure them by extracting something we call feature. For example, the length of this fish, the weight of this fish, the width, the color. And based on these features, we can start to classify whether it is a salmon fish or a sea bass fish. This is basically by putting this measurement into what we call a feature space. So let's say I measure the height and the width. I measure the height and width and then put this measurement on this space. And before we start, we need to know some background. This is called likelihood. Where in this space most likely the salmon will live, and where in this space most likely the sea bass is lived. So if we measure a point, we can check clearly this belongs to the salmon or the sea bass. So this is a classification, and usually it happens by using features. So for example, if I ask you which feature is better in between these 2 examples, this is a salmon, the black color, and the red color, it's not clear here, but the red color is the sea bass. We can easily understand that perhaps the second one is better. This is because it is more separable, meaning we can easily identify the right side from the left side. Here they are overlapping, and overlapping is a problem. Also, how many features to use? For example, these are lightness, or the color, or the brightness of the picture, and this is the width of the fish. So if we use these 2 features, we can find this line. If we use only the lightness, the brightness, we have this distribution as one-dimensional feature. If we use only the width, we have this feature. So we can see that width, pretty much they are overlapping, so this is not a good feature to use. Brightness is good feature because they are not overlapping, separable. But if we use only the lightness, we will use this classification boundary, this yellow line. We can notice that in two-dimensional, the black line is better separating these classes from the yellow one. So even though the width doesn't add much value, but it's still important to use it, which means we better use two-dimensional features instead of one-dimensional feature. And the complexity of the system. If we use a line, this is pretty good, but not as good as this kind of parabolic or quadratic function classification line or boundary. This is because we are trying to put this boundary in between two classes. Here, this is closer to the salmon. That's why the line is not as good as this one. But if we push it too far, it will classify every single sample we have. Every single sample will be on the red side, will be on the right side, and the black one will be on the left side. But this is called overfitting. So if we measure a new sample, it will most likely be incorrectly classified because this line is not natural line. So there is a compromise between the performance that we need to achieve and the complexity of the system we need to achieve. There are some terminologies, like in terms of actions, we are interested in classification, object retrieval, recognition. These are all almost basically the same thing. Categorization is slightly different. So, for example, if I'm trying to recognize a face, I'm trying to recognize Naeem or Sudib or Xiaoyi. But categorization is categorizing a human face from perhaps an animal face from a tree. We don't need to recognize a particular identity, but we need to recognize the category itself. This is called a categorization problem. There is also learning, means we need to learn this on the spot. These are the possible actions we can do. When we compute these actions, we can do it probabilistically. So we carry out the probabilities along the way, or we can do it deterministically, means we determine directly this is Naeem or not Naeem. Or we can do fuzzy algorithm. This basically use like a score instead of a probability. It's similar to a probability, but it's not normalized, so it's kind of a utility function. Training can be supervised, unsupervised, or reinforcement training. I think you are familiar with it. And in terms of modeling, we will come through it as well. This can be based on statistics, or based on our knowledge, empirical knowledge, or it can be based on hierarchical. So we can define what we need to model into. For example, if I need to model a face, I can say the face is basically a round shape and have some two eyes and have one nose and one mouth. This is called the hierarchical representation. So this is just a very broad terminology, and this is the introduction to the textbook. First chapter of the textbook talk about the Bayesian decision theory. I will try. So let's go back to our example. We want to classify between the salmon and sea bass. So let's say that salmon is omega 1. We will donate it as omega 1 and sea bass as omega 2. And let's say that we measure a feature. Let's say the width. I will donate it as x. So let's say I measured the width and it turned out to be 2 centimeters. Which object, is it a salmon or a sea bass that I measured 2 centimeters from? So this is the problem that we are interested to classify. Basically, the solution is easy. The probability that this is omega given my measurement, the 2 centimeters, if this is turn out to be larger than omega 2, then I will say, okay, the measurement is coming from the omega 1 because the probability is higher. If the probability of omega 2 is higher than omega 1, then I will say, okay, the measurement is coming from omega 2, belongs to omega 2. So the meaning of this notation means if the probability is larger than this one, this decision is x belong to omega 1. If the right side probability is larger than the left side, then x belongs to the right side, which is omega 2. You will notice that we do not know how to measure this probability. How can we know this, the probability that a salmon base is here giving my measurement is 2 centimeters? But using a Bayesian theory, which is a very, very important theory. I learned this theory when I was in college. I learned it again when I was in master student, and I realized the potential of this theory. This is the key equation for making inference. Using this theory, you can make a probability of anything. I can tell you what is the salary of Obama by the probability of having Obama this salary, just because of I can measure some features, and then I can use the Bayesian theory to invert this probability. So this is basically very important, and almost every field that we use inference, we use this theory one way or another. So let's talk about it in here. We want to compute the probability of omega 1 given my measurement, so I can flip it in this way. This part is what we call posterior probability. This is what we want to measure. This is a likelihood probability. What is the probability that, this is inverted, what is the probability that I measure 2 centimeters given that it is a C-phase? This is very easy to actually conduct. I will talk about it in the next slide, but this can be done by, before we start, we know that it's a salmon or it's a C-base because it's a given. So I can put a C-base, I know it is a C-base, and I can measure it several times and construct this probability. This is called the likelihood probability. I will talk about how to construct it later on, but this is very easy to compute. And this is what we call prior probability. What is the probability that through my production line, I will have C-base or salmon? Let's say that I know maybe 60% of the fishes that come through my line is sea-base or salmon. So this is also easy to compute. And this is the tricky part. This is the evidence probability. Many people think this is just a normalizer, we can ignore it, or we don't have to pay more attention to it. Some people express it into a total probability theory. We will see this through the next slides. So this is the decision that we can use. We are interested to find also not only where is my decision, but what is the error involved in this decision. So we compute what we call expected error. So the expected error, basically, this equation, let's say that for now I'm going to ignore the evidence and the prior probability and focus on the likelihood. So the decision at here says that if the likelihood of omega 1 is larger than omega 2, this is omega 1. So the boundary is basically if this characteristic is larger than this characteristic, this is omega 1. Once it goes below it, it becomes omega 2. And the decision boundary is exactly at this intersection, right? So the error bound here is if I cross this boundary and said this is omega 2, but the object is in reality omega 1, this is an error. And to detect this error, we just find the minimum of these two probabilities. When we conduct this integral component, this px will go here. This px will go with this one, and the prior probability is not involved in the integral part, so we can get it out. So this is just an area. So basically, it will converge to this equation, which means the error is the area at here multiplied by the prior probability of omega 1, and the area at here multiplied by the prior probability of omega 2. And this makes sense, because if we have 20% salmon, then the error at here will have 20% weight. This is the meaning of this equation, and so forth, so vice versa. So this is the basics. I will go faster slightly because of the time. So some people use what we call cost-based classification rule. So they involve some cost. Basically, they say, okay, we need to make sure that we don't make false classification with this rate. The rate of false classification should be below a certain threshold. Based on this, we can redefine our boundary using this equation. So the boundary turned out to be like this. Also, Minimax think in the opposite way. Think, okay, let's make a decision such that the error is minimum. The maximum error we can get is as minimum as possible. What is the maximum error? If I push this boundary to the right, the error involved on omega 1 is smaller and smaller. This area is smaller and smaller. But this area is larger and larger. And if I push it on the left side, it's vice versa. So the maximum error is basically the maximum of these two. We want to minimize that. So we just saw this equation a little earlier. If we are talking about a binary classification, means that the probability of omega 1 and omega 2 equal to 1, the summation of them. So we can put this one as 1 minus p of omega 1. This will turn out to be a linear equation. And we need to minimize the error, so we need to make sure this linear equation is not function of the prior, which means we need to set a at 0. When we set a at 0, this means that the area at here is equal to the area at here. So Minimax Classifier, what it does is it makes sure that the area under the curve on the left side of the boundary equal to the area under the curve in the right side of the boundary. And it basically has a very good feature. It is not function anymore of the prior probability. It's just a constant. So many people use it. Name and person test provided a slightly variant version of this one. Not only they want to minimize the error, they want to minimize the error subjected to another constraint that one of these error is less than a particular value, and it will also converge to a similar formula. So now we know how to find these boundaries using this kind of equations, right? This equation is what we call discriminant function. Discriminant function basically is a function in which we can easily discriminate between one class and the other class. So in our formula, this equation was the likelihood multiplied by the prior. If you notice that here, perhaps in this version, if we multiply the prior in both sides, so likelihood by the prior less than or equal than or greater than the likelihood by the prior. So this is one example of the discriminant function in case of a Bayesian classifier, in particular naive Bayesian classifier. One thing you will notice quickly is this likelihood, we are talking right now about one feature, but in general we may have multiple features, meaning that x can be x1, x2, x3, x4. Measuring this probability can be slightly difficult. Usually in naive, we use the assumption that these features are independent, which means the probability of x1, x2, x3, x4 giving omega is basically the multiplication of x1 giving omega by x2 giving omega by so forth. So this will turn out to be multiple probabilities multiplied by each other. This is problematic because each probability is scaled from 0 to 1. When you multiply even 99% by itself 100 times, it will converge to very, very close to 0, and you will not be able to trace it anymore. So usually in computational, we don't use this probability term. We use the monotonically increasing function, in particular the log, because it will have the same property, increasing and decreasing with the probability, but it is more easy to compute in the computer than multiplying the probabilities. But just make sure that you know that this is not a probability anymore. Once we introduce this monotonically increasing function, this becomes a score, not a probability. And that's why we don't call this discriminant probability. We call this discriminant function because it can lose its probability meaning in the end. Okay, so we talked about likelihood. How can we measure likelihood? As I said, likelihood is very easy. It's just the probability of measuring a particular feature given a class. So we can just find a class, put it in front of our camera or get data from this class, labeled data, measure the feature multiple times, and create a histogram. What we need to do next is to model this histogram. This involves some empirical knowledge. We need to know if this is multimodal or unimodal, which distribution is better fitting this one. But in reality, most of the time we just use Gaussian, 99% of the time. Sometimes we use Bayesian or exponential distribution to model the likelihood, and it most likely is unimodal, one peak only. We need also to involve a model fitting. There will be a problem of modeling this as a Gaussian. I will explain this problem later on. So let's talk about a Gaussian in particular because it's so much used. This is the probability of a Gaussian. So when we do model fitting, we only need to find the mu and the sigma of this Gaussian. Once we find it, we can compute the likelihood of measuring a particular feature giving the object at any point. We can construct again the discriminant function, and you can see the value why people use a log in particular as a monotonically increasing function other than others, because it has such a good feature here. We can remove the exponential, and the boundary that we will use is eventually given by this equation. One thing you need to notice in this equation is in terms of the measurement x, which is the unknown here that we need to measure, it's kind of polynomial, meaning that it can be quadratic. The boundary decision is quadratic, it's not linear anymore. But if we assume that the two distributions have the same sigma, in that case it will truncate to be a linear equation. So this is an important role at here. You will notice that if we have the same sigma of two classes, the boundary in 1D, 2D, 3D, or any other D will be hyperdimensional plane. If these are not the same, this will be a hyperdimensional surface following a quadratic formula, as this kind of charts show in the textbook. Yes. So I will try to explain this in more detail. Let me put this here. Okay. So we are trying to classify between salmon and sea bass, right? So what can we do? I will explain the setting of the problem. Now we have, let's assume, a camera, and we have a production line, and there is a fish coming in front of the camera, and we don't know what fish it is. We need to know if this is a salmon or a sea bass. So the first thing we need to know is what it is measured like. This is a feature. Let's say I will talk about one feature, length. So I will measure the length of this fish, and then based on this length, I will check, is it a salmon or a sea bass, okay? So this is the length. And this also is the length. Let's remove this one. So probabilistically, if I know that the probability of a salmon giving the length I just measured, let's say I measured 2 centimeters. This is a given now because I already measured it. If the probability that this 2 centimeters coming from a salmon is higher than the probability that this 2 centimeters coming from a sea bass, I will tell this is the salmon. Otherwise, I will say this is a sea bass. Okay? I cannot measure this directly, but what I can do is use Bayesian theory to flip it. So this becomes the probability. This is the most important part. 2 centimeter length giving salmon. And this is the 2 centimeter giving sea bass. So if this probability term is larger, this becomes the salmon. Otherwise, it's a sea bass. Okay, so this is quite easy to measure. How can I measure this one? This basically says what is the probability giving this is a salmon that I get 2 centimeters. I need to know this one before this setup, before the fish come in front of my camera and I measure. So before I start this production line, maybe 1 week later, 1 week earlier or 2 weeks earlier in my lab, I have a salmon. I know this is exactly a salmon and I have a sea bass. So I put the salmon in front of the camera, knowing that it's a salmon, and then measure the length multiple times, many times. So let's say I measure first time, it turned out to be 1 centimeter. So let's say this is the length, and this is salmon. So let's say that I put the salmon in front of my camera and measure the length, turned out to be 2 centimeters. So I make a mark at here. And then I measure it again. It turned out to be 3 centimeters. I put another mark at here. And then measure it again, 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters, 2 centimeters, and so forth. So I will make many marks. This is called histogram. And this is the likelihood, because I already know it's a salmon, so what I'm measuring is the probability that I get a measurement of the length, given that this is a salmon. And then I just fit it, model this probability. And do the same thing with the sea bass. So I have to put the sea bass in front of the camera and make another likelihood of the length given sea bass, and make another distribution at here. Hopefully these two distributions will not be overlapping. Here this is maybe too many, so I will give another example. Yeah. So this is for example salmon, and this is sea bass, and this is the length. They should not be overlapping. If they are overlapping, this means that the length is not a good feature to measure. For example, if sea bass and salmon have 5 centimeter length, all of them, I cannot get any more information if I measure something and turn out 5 centimeter, because I don't know if it's a salmon or a sea bass. So in that case, I need to use a different feature, not the length, perhaps the weight or the width or something else. But if the length is different between these two fishes, one of them is 2 centimeters, the other one is 5 centimeters. In that case, if I measure something and turn out to be 4.5, it's close to the 5, not to the 2, right? So I can use length in that case as a feature, right? If you don't follow me or have any questions, just tell me anytime.
Make a pause.
Okay. So we now know what is the meaning of a likelihood, right? And okay, I will repeat it again. I'm sorry. So a likelihood is basically what is the probability that we get a measurement giving an object. In this example, what is the probability that if I told you, okay, what is the probability that I measure 5 centimeters from a salmon? You can directly look at this graph and tell me, aha, this probability is like this, right? So this is what we call likelihood. The probability of a particular length giving, or a particular feature measurement and giving an object. We need to do this for every object, for every feature. In our example at here, we have one feature, the length, and we have two objects. So we need to make two distributions, one for the salmon, one for the sea bass. All right. After we create this histogram, we need to model it. So we have these samples. We need to select what is the best distribution to fit it. This can be done by just looking at it and thinking, aha, this looks like a Gaussian, or looks like a polynomial, or a Poisson, or something. But most of the time, especially if the feature is discriminant, is good feature, it turned out to be a Gaussian 99% of the time. Sometimes we use a Poisson or an exponential. But Gaussian.
The number of samples are more than it will turn out to be Gaussian.
Yeah, exactly. Central limit theorem will guarantee that if it's a good feature and we have enough data, it will turn out to be a Gaussian. So for this Gaussian, the textbook in particular gave a detailed example. So what if this likelihood is a Gaussian? If this likelihood is a Gaussian, we know the discriminant function. Discriminant function, I will go back to explain to make sure that it's understood. So we know a little earlier that even if we need to classify this is a salmon or a sea bass, yeah, this is not correct. This is sea bass. Sorry. So in that case, we need to decide what is the probability, and we cannot measure this one, so we use this formula instead. For now, let's ignore that normalizer, because this normalizer is a probability, right? It's always above 0, so we can just throw it from both sides. So it will be if this is greater or less, that the upper term is greater or less than the other term, we can take a decision at that boundary. So this is what we call a discriminant function. And we use the monotonically increasing function because of the problem of indictability of the probability multiplication. So given that this is a Gaussian, we can now start to express this Gaussian in this term and compute the boundary for this again. This boundary this time is very important to know. We are talking about two objects, right? The salmon and sea bass, right? Sea bass. Mm-hmm. Each one of them, as I said, will have its own Gaussian, right? So each one of them will maybe have different mu and different sigma, right? So if the two Gaussians have different sigmas, this is the general formula for it. And it will be a quadratic formula for the measurement, which is the length. So based on the length, the boundary, the decision boundary is going to be quadratic. But if the two distribution, the two Gaussian, have the same sigma, this boundary will be a linear boundary. So that is the meaning of this distribution. In this textbook, they give an example of 1D, 2D, 3D. But you don't have to think about it because it can be confusing. Just think about, for example, 1D. In case of 1D, if the sigmas are the same, you can see it's a line, right? The decision is a line. In 2D, the two distributions have the same sigma, so you'll see it underneath it as a line. And in 3D, a Gaussian in 3D is like a hyperellipsoid. We call hyperellipsoid. It can be thought about like a sphere, but the sphere is a special case. So the boundary will be hyperplane, like cutting the space. The right side is sea bass, and the left side is a salmon. But if the sigma is different, unfortunately, the textbook only gives an example in 3D. I will show you an example in 2D later on. But the distribution will look like a polynomial or a quadratic formula. So the boundary will be a little weird. One important part of it is this is in 2D. So you can see that the boundary is not a line anymore. It's kind of quadratic formula, right? It's a quadratic formula, right? So this is for example, omega 1. So omega 1 is living in this part of the space. If we measure, this is feature space. If we measure a length or any feature that happen to be here, we can directly say this is omega 1. If we measure a feature and in this space, this area, we will say directly this is omega 4. And this is omega 3 and omega 2. One problem we can notice directly from this graph is if I measure a feature at here, it's omega 4, which is reasonable. Omega 3 is here. Omega 2, these are classes. But what is this? This means that if we measure a feature at here, it will tell us it's omega 4, even though the likelihood of omega 4 is in this side, right? So how come it happened to exist in this part? That is because the decision boundary just blindly look if the distribution is higher or not. And just because this distribution have large sigma, means it's wide in space, at some point it will catch up with the other distributions and will be larger than these distributions, and this will happen to show this problem. Another example of this problem is here. So this is another example I gave in which we have multiple classes. You will see that the gray class starts to catch up with the green one at here, and this is a problematic. Why this problem happens? Because when we measure these features and model it as a Gaussian, this Gaussian tells us the probability is not zero anywhere. Even at very far distance, there is a slight probability. This is not logical because we can, for example, if this is length, we can never measure a length in negative. And if this is a salmon, I cannot measure a length of a salmon as 10 kilometers. But the Gaussian will tell us there is a probability that a salmon will give us a length of a 10 kilometer. And that is a problem, and I will show you how to fix it later on. So the textbook gives us bounds for the error. I discussed how we can measure the error, but the error sometimes is difficult to measure, so we are interested to find the bound. Chernoff gave a formula to find the bound. I think it's not very important, so I'll just skip it. And Patakaria give a special case of a Chernoff bound in which beta is 0.5. So this is the Bayesian classifier. The textbook didn't touch about the Bayesian network and belief network, so I will quickly go through them and explain them. Belief network is a network in which we can think of it as a causal and effect. So if I am sleeping, for example, I can just wake up, or I can have an accident if I'm driving and sleeping at the same time. So there can be some cause and effect. Usually we don't know the causes. We only can measure the effect, but we can do an inference. Based on the effect, we can tell. So for example, if the grass is wet, this means probably it was raining, or the gardener was here, one of these two. If I measure, I had an accident and it was wet, the grass is wet, then maybe it was raining, and just because of that I had an accident. So from the effects, we can have an inference of what causes it. This is called a belief network. We can form it in this kind of thing: parent causes, effects, and sub-effects, and so forth. A Bayesian network doesn't discriminate between a cause and effect. A Bayesian network is just a node. It doesn't discriminate. This node is a parent or a child, or a cause or effect. It's just a node, a random variable, and they are connected by some kind of mutual probabilities. This textbook is really nice. They talk about something called d-separation. When we do inference in Bayesian network, it becomes very difficult because of this conditional probability. But sometimes we can take advantage of based on what we call d-separation. For example, because of the flow at here, this is digraph. So because of the flow, we can directly tell that x and t are deconnected. So what happened in x will affect t. But x and y are d-separated, means that what happened in x and what happened in y are not necessarily affecting each other, because they are disconnected by t. Both of them goes in t, so they will not see each other or not interact with each other. There are some rules. I will just skip it quickly because of the time. But there are some rules. Based on these rules, we can tell if one of these features will be affecting the other or not. Basically, if one of these features is function of the other or dependent on the other or not. If it's not dependent on the other, the probability is much easier because they are independent, and independent features have such good properties. So a Bayesian network can be formed in this way. I will just give a notation at here. I will say that a random variable, generally I will donate it as f, and the object ID, for example, is capital. And if I measure a feature, I will use a small letter to tell this is measured. We call it instantiated or truncated or clamped, means it's measured right now. So a network can be formed in this way. We have multiple features, and we need to know what is the object that gives us these features. And this object can be thought of as a cause. This object is the cause that we measure this particular measurement of the features. How to do the inference? First, we can take advantage of the deseparation. Because of this network, this feature and this feature are not interacting because they are separated by the cause, the parent. So they are independent. And this is particular in the naive Bayesian network. They completely are independent. So when we measure the likelihood, as we saw the likelihood a little bit earlier, the probability of a feature giving the object ID, this is just the multiplication of all the individual features. I think I have to go through faster. So this lecture notes give an example of how to do inference. I will just skip most of it. I will go to the important part. The important part is it can be thought of as 1 over 1 plus. This is what we call negative likelihood and positive likelihood. This is the likelihood of not target object, and this is the likelihood of the target object we are trying to measure. I gave an example some time ago in our SAGE, in which I put some distributions and show you the how we can do the classification. And this is the class. I can show it over there. So yes. So this is a histogram. This is a feature likelihood, as I explained. We need to model it. So in this case, I used Gaussian and fitted the Gaussian for them. The Gaussian told me one object is living in 5 mu, and the other one is -5 with this sigma. By looking at it, I can think, these are not overlapping, which means it's a good feature we can use. So given these features, I used the formula I just showed over there for classification. It tells me this distribution. One problem is, as I explained, a measurement at here will tell me this is directly the blue one. So the blue probability at here is 100%, and it is 0, even though I don't have a measurement, just because. And if one of them is slightly flatter than the other, the probability will flip, as I showed you in the 2D dimension. So this is problematic, and I told you the problem here comes mainly because when we use the Gaussian tells me there is a probability at very far, even if it's not sensible. To fix this problem, we can use something like Laplace smoothing. Laplace smoothing concept is very easy. It assumes that because this is kind of an undersampled problem, we didn't have enough measurement at here. That's why the problem happens. So they assume that every outcome of an experiment happens. It's just that we don't have time or enough resources to capture it. So we can assume that at least every outcome happens once before we start collecting our data. And that what it means is the likelihood will be offsetted, marginalized by some very small offset. This is the probability that something happens before we measure. Just by adding this term, the decision starts to reach 50% at here and 50% at here. We can see it at here. So this is the advantage of Laplace smoothing, and this is the fix to the problems I showed you earlier, this particular omega problem at here. If we added a Laplace smoothing, this will turn out to be 50%, and it will not have this problem. And similarly at here, this is an example. Okay. Yeah. So at here, you can see the green one have 100%, and then suddenly flip, and this one came along. But if I added some Laplace smoothing, you will see it starts to terminate at here. And depending on how much Laplace smoothing you add, it will have different behavior. If we add a very large Laplace smoothing, the probabilities will not reach 100% anymore. They will be trimmed much, and they will be 90%, 80%, and so forth. So how to decide this Laplace smoothing? It's an application domain. So each domain have its own.
You show the code for that.
The code is inside the Excel sheet. So if you zoom out here. Okay, let me open it in Excel. Oh, sorry. So So these are the probabilities, and this is the final probability. Yeah, and the equations are here, so you can directly see the equations if you want, if you are interested. And
Make it a little bigger.
this equation.
Enlarge.
Okay, just 1 second.
Uh-huh.
So at first, at first I have a measurement of a feature. I just scanned it because I want to draw it. And then probability of a feature giving A and feature giving B and C and D. I have here 5 classes, not 2. And then I check the nearest neighbor because this is the negative likelihood. I compute the posterior probability of these 5 objects and then plot it. And the equations as here. And these are the mu, the mean, and this is sigma. So you can, if you want to try different distributions, you can just change. For example, I can put this one is 0 minus 5 minus 10. And this is goes to here, overlapping with something else.
나이브가 어쨌든 저 프레젠테이션을 업로드 시켜줬으니까 실제로 다운로드해서 보면서 나중에 필요할 때 이제 코딩 새로 하지 않고도 이용해서 시뮬레이션 바로 할 수 있으니까 활용하도록 하세요. Okay, you can continue.
Yes. If you're interested, the equations in this Excel sheet are exactly the same equations in this example, so you can find the equations here as well. Yeah. So. Okay, so this summarizes the Bayesian network, and the remaining one is the demo. I think we may have some time to demo. I'll quickly show it. If you have any questions at any time, just stop. So, Sorry. So right now I'm using an Action Pro. Action Pro is a 3D camera that uses a projector in infrared and a camera infrared and camera in RGB. So you can see this is 3D space. Our objective at here is to recognize these objects and find which one of them is which one. So the first thing we need to do is segmentation, as I explained in the very first slide. I need to know where in this area is an object or not object. So this is what we do. We find the context. The context here is a table. How can I find this table? If you remember, I put an example also in Sage, in which I find the biggest plane. I fit a plane. So this is exactly the same concept. I use PCA to find the surface normal and then find the points belonging to it. Once I find it, I can just cut it, and anything on top of it is basically the object. So let me run the recognition, the shell descriptor part. Yeah. So first we use Octree. This point cloud this is technical a little bit, but this point cloud is very dense, and there are a lot of data. So we don't do this data directly; we sample them.
More loud.
Yes. We sample them. So instead of taking every point and measure it, we represent a group of points as one voxel or one box, and we take the center of this box and process it. These are these boxes. This is
what technique they use? Finite element method or?
At here, this is Octree. This is what we Octree representation. It's a voxel representation. So this will make the computation much faster. That's why we can recognize the objects. So here are the models and perhaps the titles. Let me go to the top view so you can see it better. The system is struggling to find the pose of this object. Pose is a different problem. It's not a classification problem, but I'm going to ignore it for now.
Did you type those names or the camera is...
No, I know this name. No, it's my code at here knows which object is which object based on the features. I have to print the command manually. It didn't learn the name by itself, of course. But So at here, this is exactly a naive Bayesian classifier, like we explained and like I showed in Sagi. Only difference is at here I have 10 classes, 10 objects, and I use, I think, about 12 features. These are geometrical features like the height of the object, the width of the object, some features about the object, and so forth. Right now, I can recognize it maybe under around 30 millisecond, these 5 objects, and it have the potential to recognize up to 10 objects in the database right now, and we can expand it as much as we want. And it is live in the sense that you can just like move stuff around, and it will be recognized and so forth. Okay, the problem is
카메라한테 명령을 줘서 자꾸 찍는 거 방향을 바꿔주는 소리야? 그래서 you gave a command, so it take a picture in the different directions.
No, it's one direction. This is the picture.
It's one direction?
Yeah, this is a 2D picture, and this is the 3D from the top view.
What are these?
This means this camera runs around 60 hertz. So every time I capture the data and recognize all the objects inside, it takes me around 30 milliseconds. So this is cycle time. Every 30 milliseconds, I can process this data. Just because we are using a naive Bayesian network, there are some limitations. One of the limitations, for example, is if I put these two objects on top of each other, you will see that it's recognized.
No.
Maybe if I put this. Sorry. So I don't have to turn it on, but
this one should work. Okay, you can talk.
I'm trying to show a particular example. Yes. So this is recognized as a completely different object, similar to Pringles. It's called gray flag, but it's similar to Pringles. What happens is when I measure the height, here the height is similar to Pringles. So the system directly thinks this is a Pringles. And this is a problem of using very small number of features and Bayesian network in particular. Multiplying the probabilities, and because the height is very dominant, it will override everything else, and it thinks this is a Bayesian network. The reason it knows that something is unknown, like if I put this like precisely.
Please talk.
Yes. So let me.
You can help me.
Thank you. Let me try to give another example. Let's put this one in front of the camera. You will see what happens.
Okay.
Can you move them apart from each other because the classification? Yeah. So go from It thinks this is a Mickey cup. It's not, well, I didn't show you a Mickey cup. It's one of the objects we use in the 10 objects we have. But this is clearly not that cup. This is just an arbitrary cup that happens to exist in the scene. But this cup have very similar shape to the Mickey cup I have in database, so that's why it is classified as a Mickey cup. Similarly, if I put something random in the scene, can you make them far from each other? Because I need to classify them. Yellow cup. Okay. So this is glassbox. Glassbox is, I will go from the top view. So it says unknown, and then suddenly glassbox, and then unknown. Unknown because we are using Laplace smoothing. So when the probability goes to near 50%, because of Laplace smoothing, I will say it's unknown. But sometimes it looks like a glassbox. Glassbox is like the box we use to put our glasses in. It's one of the database. Just because it have similar shape, the classifier mistakenly think this is a glassbox. So this shows the limitations of using a Bayesian network with a finite number of features. It can mistake. Would you like to put this?
Yes.
Okay, this is interesting. This is interesting. This is going to be difficult to classify. I think it's a cider can.
Okay.
The problem of this object is it's transparent. So transparent object, I will show you first. No, okay. So transparent object doesn't have point cloud. The camera cannot see it. It sees through it. So that's why it is not complete object, and the lower part of it, when it appears, it looks like a cider can, the poster one. So when I so sometimes you will see like a cider can popping up. Sometimes it looks like the opt tree, this opt tree. So it's not very stable. So this shows the limitation of the system. One big assumption in naive Bayesian classifier is we have to know every object that happens to exist in the scene. We cannot allow any new object to appear, because if a new object appears and it is similar to one of our objects, it will give a misclassification like what we saw at here. So that was the live demo and the problems I explained about the Bayesian classifier. In our lab right now, we are trying to go to Bayesian to deep learning, and I will show the properties of deep learning when I go to that part in the presentation, because it's important as well. So Bayesian.
Times are almost up, but still, we reserve this room until 3 p.m., so we still have time. But there are one student who have a class, so if you have.
Okay, so the time is limited, so I'll try to quickly go faster. So the Bayesian networks, I briefly introduced them. I didn't talk about them in detail. There are different types of Bayesian networks: naive Bayesian network, tree-augmented naive Bayesian network. This is called I forget the name of this one, but this is a hidden Markov model. This is the general Bayesian network. The difference between them is the dependency levels. So tree-augmented naive Bayesian network allow features to have some dependencies. This one allows subgraphs inside the network. Hidden Markov model have a specific way of connecting the dependencies, and general network is a general connected network. Means there is no parent or no subparent, everyone is a node. So the conclusion. I talk about belief network and Bayesian network, right? Belief network have a particular structure, cause and effect. A Bayesian network doesn't follow that. It's just any node is connected to any node. So when we have a problem, do we have to follow a reasonable cause and effect structure, or we can do anything? Mathematically, we can do anything. So we can build a network that flips the cause and effect, have the effect root to the cause. Mathematically, it is correct. But the best behavior comes when we follow our intuition, which means the cause and effect, which means we follow the belief network. That was the first chapter. So the second chapter, we are talking.
Before.
So in this chapter, we will talk about the estimation problem. This is not classification this time; it's an estimation. So we have a distribution, and we want to know the parameters of this distribution. For example, in case of Gaussian distribution, we need to know the mean and variance. So these estimation methods can help us find these parameters. So let's suppose that we have, for example, a likelihood distribution or any other distribution in which we can observe some parameter d, and we would like to estimate the parameter of the model theta. How can we do that? There are multiple ways. One approach is called maximum a posteriori estimate. It assumes basically that the theta that we are trying to measure is a random variable, and we have some prior probability. We know the prior probability. And of course, we know the likelihood. So what it does, it says, okay, let's maximize the posterior probability, which can be expressed as the prior probability by the Bayesian theorem. The denominator at here is a normalizer, I told you before, so sometimes we just ignore it. The maximum function is still standing. And if we use the log part, then this will be plus log at here. So this is the formula for the maximum posterior probability. It assumes that we know the prior. So if we don't know the prior, we can try the maximum likelihood estimate. Maximum likelihood estimate is slightly different. It's assuming that theta is not a distribution. It is just a fixed parameter. We just don't know it. So in order to find it, they try to maximize the likelihood directly. So this time it's different. We are not trying to maximize the posterior. We are trying to maximize the likelihood. And if the likelihood is composing of features that are independent, so these features are multiplied by each other because they are independent. When we take the log, this will be summation instead of multiplication. How can we find it? We can find it by two ways in the maximum likelihood estimate. We can do it analytically. because we are trying to find the maximum, so we can take the derivative and equate it to 0. Or we can do it numerically by some kind of an algorithm that will try step by step to find the best value. This is a quick example of maximum likelihood estimate. If we have a Gaussian distribution in a very simple form, it is that equation. Let's suppose that we don't know the mu value, the mean. We want to find the mean. Let's suppose that we measure multiple x's. So when we take the derivative of this log, this will be in this formula. When we get the mu from this formula, it will turn out to be exactly the mu we expect it to be. So maximum likelihood can be found. This is an analytical approach. It can be also found by an iterative approach. The third approach is called the Bayesian estimate. Bayesian estimate assumes that theta is random variable, and we don't know the prior, but we have some vague information about it. So the recursive approach of Bayesian starts with an arbitrary probability, and then refine it step by step. Rather than explaining it, I will give you an example that will explain it slightly better. So this is an example I put in our Sage. I think it will not work here, so I want to copy the code. So I'll start with 0. So let's say that I have a coin, right? And I want to toss this coin, and I want to compute the probability that I can get a head. I don't know, it can be head or tail, right? But let's say I don't know first what is the probability. So at the very beginning, the probability that I can get a head is 100% everywhere, meaning that it can be 0%, it can be 2%, 20%, 40%, 60, or 100%. So I don't know anything yet at this point. I start by tossing the coin one time, and then get the probability from this tossing coin. So once I toss it one time, let's say I get a head. So the head is 100% likelihood, and the tail is 0. I multiply by the prior, so this becomes from 0 to 1, and then normalize it, so it becomes from 0 to 2. So this is my new probability. Now 100% I get a head, 0% I get a tail, just because I tossed the coin one time. Let's toss the coin another time. This time, 2 times happen to be tails, so the probability is even higher in tails, but let me toss it another time. Come on. Okay, 1 head and 1 tail. In this case, the probability will start to take a shape in between, right? If I toss it many times, you'll see that the probability is converging to 50%. Let me toss it like maybe 100,000. So you can see that the posterior probability is peaking at 50%, which means the probability that I can get ahead is 50%, given that I have enough number of samples. So this is the approach of a Bayesian estimate. So this is the same example. I'm explaining it multiple times. So if we toss it enough times, it will eventually converge to 50%. Okay, this is the problem, and this is what Anne asked me about earlier. So let's suppose that I toss the coin multiple times, and every time I toss it, by chance, it happened to be tail, every time. So the probability that I get a head is going to be 0%, because I don't know, I didn't see any head anymore, so it will become difficult. This is called an undersampled problem, and so the solution to this problem is to have as many samples as we can, and also try to minimize the number of features. The problem also is we don't need to minimize the number of features, because the more features we have, the more separability we can have. For example, 1 dimension, you can see there is overlapping area. In 2 dimension, we have slightly less overlap. 3 dimension, there is no overlap at all. We can separate these 2 distributions from each other. So this creates a paradox. We need to add more features, but if we add more features, we need to have more samples. Otherwise, we will fall into this problem. And the solution to this problem is usually try to select the minimum number of dimensions or features that can guarantee non-overlap. How can we achieve this? There are 2 directions in research. One of them is called dimensionality reduction, like the PCA SVD we studied in this course. It can find the optimal solution because we can find the dimensions that are associated to the maximum eigenvalues. So it is guaranteed it will find the optimal solution. But the problem is it will lose its physical meaning. For example, let's say that I started from 3 features: height, color, and let's say shape. And then after I do the PCA analysis, the maximum eigenvector is a linear combination of 2. Let's say 20% height and 80% color. So this new dimension space is kind of weird because if I move along that axis by 2, this means that I'm moving 20% color and 80% height, and this is not physical. How can I combine these two together? So people don't like this one because it's really difficult to debug, because it doesn't have a physical meaning. The other direction of research is feature selection. As you said, sometimes it's better to select the features, not to combine them. And this allows us to put our empirical knowledge. Sometimes we can know, like we saw before, we can look at the distribution and know which feature is better than the others. But it doesn't guarantee a separable solution. We have to research harder to make sure this is guaranteed. So the last approach for parameter estimate is expected maximization. Because of the time, I'll just quickly go through it. It assumes that we need to maximize the expectation, not the likelihood directly. Why we maximize the expectation? In this problem, it is slightly different. We can measure one of the parameter, but the other parameter is not measurable. We call it hidden variable. And because of that, we cannot use the maximum likelihood estimate. But when we maximize not the likelihood, but we maximize the expectation of the likelihood, we can marginalize that hidden variable. Effectively, we can just remove it from the equation, and then we can iterate and find the best solution like we do in the maximum likelihood estimate. I'm not going to go in detail because of the time, so that was the parameter estimate. Do you have any questions about it? So now I will let my colleague Naeem continue the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Naguib. Thank you, everyone. As Naguib discussed about the likelihood method and the posterior method, right? So those methods were based on the parameters, like we have to minimize the parameters. Now there is a second approach, which is...
Let's start it. Let's make it new. Okay, yeah, we will close up the first part of the presentation and we will continue in the new session. Okay.